This was actually something that happened to me, and I still struggle to understand it. As a younger child, maybe 7 or 8, I think, I lived in a small house with an older brother I'll call Jeff. He was probably 4 or 5 years older than me, as well as my dad and my pregnant mother. I didn't get along with my brother, or rather, he didn't get along with me. It was just the two of us, so, of course, I wanted to play and hang out with him, but it was like he hated me. I don't know why or if I did something, but if so, I don't remember ever doing anything. It started as Jeff just not wanting to have anything to do with me. I would ask if he wanted to play cards or something, and he would say no. When one of us complained about being bored, my parents would tell us to go play together and he would get mad at me for it. He would tell me things like he hated me and he didn't want to play with me, so I would end up playing alone while he sat on his bed and stared at the ceiling or watched TV. We had a small old TV in our room that got probably 4 channels. Sometimes while we were alone, like in our room or out back playing, he would hit me or push me down. He would call me names, call me useless, and all for no apparent reason. We would just be taking turns going across the monkey bars on our playset, and he would snap. And if I told my parents, he would then punish me when we went to bed. So I had a lot of accidental falls and trips, and my parents were none the wiser. So that's where this incident takes place. Jeff was becoming more and more aggressive towards me. Anytime he could, and he would even try to hurt me with anything he could, like stabbing my arm with a pencil or making me step on thumbtacks. One night after dinner, I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth. Jeff knocked on the door and kept demanding that I get out. So I finished quickly, and as I left the bathroom, I said something to him about being patient, and as I walked past him, he pushed me, causing me to fall down the stairs. However, my mom was just walking by and saw him do this, so he got into a lot of trouble for it. I was more scared that he got in trouble than happy because I could feel the anger in him and knew that I wasn't going to be able to sleep that night. So we went to bed as normal. We had bunk beds and he was on top. I remember I tried to stay awake as long as possible, worried he would hurt me, but the sleep won and I ended up drifting off. But then I woke up when I felt pressure on my chest. It was Jeff, sitting on top of me, and he looked furious. That's when I noticed I couldn't breathe. I felt like I couldn't inhale at all and was just trying to tell Jeff to get off. He just kept saying these horrible things to me, like he wished he was still an only child, that I was the worst brother, my parents didn't love me, and that I should just die. I remember being terrified for my life. I could feel something around my throat, and it was starting to hurt. I was kicking and swinging my arms, doing everything I could to get him off of me, but to no avail. The last thing I remember was the room going black, and then I could hear my mom screaming and crying my name. I could hear my dad yelling, "What did you do?" Then everything went muffled again, and I believe I went unconscious. That was the last memory I had of Jeff. I've tried very hard to remember anything after that, but I can't, and I start feeling sick when I try to. Because now things are completely different. I now live with my mom and dad who look completely different. My first mom had short, curly black hair, and she was also really short compared to the massive man my dad was. He was also bald and had a really deep voice. My new mom is almost taller than my dad, and she has medium-length brown straight hair. My new dad was thin and definitely shorter than my old dad. He also had longer blonde hair that he normally keeps braided, and he was always soft-spoken. The other weird thing is, I'm now an only child. I remember waking up one day and followed a normal routine of making my own breakfast and watching cartoons till my parents got up and took me to school. But then I started getting these visions or recollections of Jeff, and it seemed so real. I know it was. I remember the pain I endured. I remember the scent of my mother's perfume. I remember the feeling of the scar on my father's hand. When I started remembering this, I became scared that maybe I didn't survive and was given another family. I was afraid to bring it up because I didn't want to know what happened. I did miss my old parents, but I thought maybe they got in trouble too. So I always kept this to myself. I have gotten the two memories mixed up though, because I will mention something that happened in the first life, and my new parents will look confused and mention how that never happened, or that they don't remember anything like that. So now I find it difficult to bring up past memories unless the memory actually involved my new parents. So I at least knew it was this life. There was one time though that I had to ask. It was the weekend and my parents took me to a local amusement park to celebrate. I completed the school year with all passing grades, which wasn't hard for me as I always excelled at school, but it was nice to have it recognized. And I was accepted in an after-school club that focused on a different country each year. This year would be French. The kids would also have a chance to go to the country with one parent or guardian the following year. My parents were both very proud of me, and it was the most fun I remembered having. I played games with them, all of us being competitive. We rode on a few rides together and all together just had a wonderful dinner. I felt incredibly loved that it was overwhelming, and I had slipped out something about thanking them for changing my life. They were confused and asked what I meant by that and tried to just play it off as miswording something, but they didn't buy it and asked me to explain. I then asked them if I had another brother, and they denied it, looking genuinely confused. I then mentioned what I remembered about Jeff, about feeling like he was hurting me without being specific, like I needed to protect them. They looked concerned, and I just remember my mom gave me a huge hug and told me that it must have been a very vivid dream that I had, possibly when I got really sick, but assured me that nothing like that ever happened. They assured me I had always been an only child and that they knew no one by the name of Jeff. I wanted to make myself believe that everything I remembered, years of that life, was just an incredibly vivid dream. But after hearing more about my illness, it really made me think that maybe I was reborn. I didn't and still don't remember anything in this life about being ill, and nothing before it. My parents showed me pictures of me being in the hospital. Apparently, I caught strep throat and it ended up turning into pneumonia. They learned from this that I had an autoimmune disease and that the pneumonia caused me to go into a coma. The doctors warned my parents that they should be prepared for their worst and that I was probably too young to fight it. Miraculously, I started showing improvements and I did beat it. I have no memory of getting sick, being in the hospital, or even getting out of it and anything before getting sick. Since then, I've pretty much decided in my mind that I must have died that night. I think my brother killed me, and I think the boy that this body belonged to died, and for some reason that I still don't understand, I was given a second chance. I don't like to dwell on it too much because it starts making me depressed. I loved my brother, but no matter what I did, he hated me. He hated me to go to the point that he wanted me dead. And the fact that I got a second chance while another boy probably lost his life makes me feel like I am not grateful enough for what I have. I still haven't talked to my parents about this as I fear the outcome. Would they believe me? Would they make fun of me or deny it was even possible? Or could they disown me, thinking I'm not their real son? My parents are still very loving and supportive to this day, so I don't think they would, but it's still a fear I have. I think for now, I will keep it with you and your audience and be thankful for what I have. And thank you for allowing me to share this with someone. I don't think my son is the same kid. I mean, sure, he is the same person or body, but I don't think his mind or personality is the same. I know it sounds strange, but that's why I'm writing this, to further explain what I mean. My son's birth name is Cameron Michael, first and middle name. He was born May 4th, 2007. He had brown, straight hair, taking after his mom, as mine was blonde, and he always liked it on the longer side. We always let him decide what he wanted to do with his hair, never forcing him to grow it out or cut it. We just kept it managed, so either way, it wasn't in his face, but that was it. He was even beginning to like having half of his head shaved and keeping the other half long. He also enjoyed anything Marvel or insect related. He wasn't afraid to catch grasshoppers, crickets, pill bugs, or even spiders, although we wouldn't let him hold many spiders. I remember we even got him a bug catching kit for his birthday the year prior, and he was ecstatic. He was also very outgoing. Anytime we ran into another kid at the park, at the mall, you name it, he was quick to approach them, introduce himself, and ask who their favorite superhero was. As for his name, he always wanted to be called Cameron. He didn't even like the idea of being called Cam for short. So just a few important things that I can think of that changed after this incident. Back in May of 2016, we celebrated his birthday, and his big present this year was a bike. He didn't really have one prior because we were living in an apartment, but we recently moved into a rental home. He was really close to his cousin Brett and loved riding his bike when he was at his house, so we agreed to get him one this year. As expected, he was wanting to ride it immediately. When he got home from school, we had to practically barter with him to get his homework done before he went out to ride it. My wife and I would typically walk alongside him to the park so he could ride around the path or the open parking lot without much traffic. It was Sunday evening, and Cameron wanted to go ride his bike before it got late since he had school the next day. It wasn't dark yet, so we didn't have to worry about lights, but he did have reflective lights on the bike, as well as his helmet. It was just going to be me and him, as my wife was staying behind to clean up the kitchen. We left the house and started heading right towards the park. We pretty much lived behind it, so I was planning on walking down there with him, circling around, then coming back home. Everything was fine until we started walking home. There was a community board posted at the entrance, and sometimes they have events, and sometimes people like to leave their own dramatic notes, so I was glossing over it. Cameron was circling the parking lot, and I had told him to give me a moment, and he continued to ride around as he's done before. It was no different than any other time, so I wasn't worried about keeping my eye on him, as long as I could hear him. But to my horror, I also started hearing a car seemingly revving up really loud, getting closer, and then suddenly brakes squealing. I turned around and was faced with the worst thing to ever happen to me. Cameron was laying on the ground, a few feet in front of this car, with his bike underneath it, all mangled up. I ran to my son, expecting the worst. The rest of that night was a blur, and it was like I was standing still, but everyone around me was moving at hyperspeed. Yes, the person that hit him was arrested for reckless driving, and Cameron turned out all right. He had several broken bones, but surprisingly, he had a concussion and no other head or cranial damage. I am still very thankful that we bought that helmet. However, after some time, I wasn't convinced that everything was all right due to the drastic changes in him I witnessed. It was a little slow to get him back to his normal playful and curious self, but I started noticing changes. One of the first was that he was not interested in Marvel or superheroes whatsoever. His birthday was Iron Man themed, but he seemed completely uninterested in it. His interest altogether had changed. Now he was obsessed with trains and locomotives, which was fine, but it was also the amount of knowledge he seemed to have about them. He got a book on them and was showing me the pictures and explaining the different parts on it and how it worked. I asked him how he knew all this, like joking around, and he just looked at me deadpan and said, "I used to work on them," and continued talking. He was 9 years old. How could he have worked on a train? Other than the train thing, there were other personality changes, such as the shows he watched or even activities or hobbies he had. He started playing chess and he was good at it from the start. Hell, he taught me how to play because I didn't know. He also cut his hair short so it grew out evenly and parted to the side, something he never did before. He seemed fascinated in electronics though, even things as simple as our desktop. He had seen it and even used it infrequently, but he always asked about how it worked, like he had never seen it before. And one of the strangest things of all to me was the name part. He said he hated being called Cameron, and when asked if he preferred to be called Cam or even Michael, but he asked to be called Frankie. Again, I was confused because that was nowhere close to any of his names. I couldn't even recall any games or shows or movies we watched that had someone with that name. So again, I asked about the name and he said, well, that was my old name. My wife was home with us when this all happened, and she was just as confused. We tried to ask him more about the name, the train thing, and all of it, and he just broke down. He said he doesn't remember everything, but he thinks something happened when he got hit. He said he doesn't think he's in the right body and didn't know how to live with it. Then he just cried, and we did everything we could to calm him down and cheer him up. We tried not to bring it up again in front of him because we didn't want to upset him, but we tried to look into this more. We started with a therapist to ask questions for ourselves. We had no intentions of putting him through that just because he changed. Part of us thought he was a growing boy. His personality could just be changing. We really were stuck between, could this be related to the accident? Could this have damaged something that went unseen? Could it just be him getting older and just trying to find himself? But then my wife brought up the idea of past lives and that she had started reading stories about it, and she thinks it may be related to Cameron's experience. We started looking into it more, and we were both open-minded, so I think we both agreed without speaking that this was likely the scenario and decided to live with this in mind going forward. Life went on as normal as possible from then on. Slight changes in who he was, but we lived with it and we called him Frankie, and even told the rest of the family so they didn't upset him. So fast forward to 2021, we were all watching Unsolved Mysteries, and there was an episode about reincarnation, and Frankie lost it. He started talking about how that must be what happened to him, that he must have been reborn. My wife and I both just kind of went, wow, that's crazy and definitely possible, and went on with our night. Again, he was still a kid, and we didn't want to put that thought in his mind. He should be able to enjoy his life and not have some kind of crisis that he died and was born again. Things have calmed down a bit since then, again, trying to make it as normal as we possibly could. My wife and I have flirted with the idea of looking for someone who matched what we know so far of this Frankie person, but we don't even know where to start. I just really hope it hasn't and doesn't impede on my son's life. I just want him to be happy with who he is, no matter who that happens to be. This is about my younger sister, who had many visions about her past life. My parents always called her weird or claimed that she had a vivid imagination, so she only ever talks to me about them now. One of the first times she mentioned this to me was when we were playing house or superheroes. We always made up names for these games, but she always chose the same name, Charlotte. I didn't think much of it at first, but I usually swap between the same 2 or 3 names unless I learned a new name that I liked. But she always chose Charlotte. One day, we decided to have a picnic in our backyard, so we gathered up stuff to make peanut butter sandwiches and chips and headed out. One thing I will mention is that when it comes to PB&J, it could never be grape jelly. I was okay with it, but my sister would not eat it. My parents and I always said or thought that she just didn't like grapes, so we always got something else. Anyways, when we sat down to finally eat, she asked me, "So, do you remember many different lives?" I was confused by this question, so she tried explaining it more. She mentioned since I use multiple names, she was curious if I remember the past lives of multiple people. I told her no, and that I just liked the names, but she went on to explain that she used to be named Charlotte. She explained that she used to live somewhere hotter and near a beach, and that she was allergic to grapes, which is why she avoided them now. I thought in a way it made sense, but she wouldn't eat them, so we would have no idea if she's allergic to them now. Later that night during dinner, I asked my parents if we knew someone named Charlotte. They thought about it for a while, but then said no and asked why. My sister was looking at me curiously, and I explained to them that she used to be Charlotte. I remember my mom mentioning that was a good imagination, while my dad chuckled but said nothing else about it. From then, my sister continued telling me more stories of her past life. But it was later that year that we went on vacation in Texas where it became more real. We were going to a friend of my mom's house when we got turned around in a cul-de-sac. My sister pointed out one of the houses excitedly and said, "That was my old house." Well, it used to be my parents', but I inherited it when they died. My dad was driving and looked up at us in the back seat while my mom looked back in confusion. She said, "What are you talking about?" My sister went on to explain that she knew that was the one because of the front deck. It had an awning and was screened in with an old swinging seat hanging from the roof. She said she used to sit there and drink coffee while she read, especially when it was raining. My dad said nothing, while my mom just stared at my sister and then turned back around to face forward. I remember it was awkward for a few seconds when my sister said, "I had a bad reaction to the juice I was drinking and I couldn't breathe." This caused my mom to snap and say something like, "Enough." She started asking us what we watched to learn that, and even asked my dad what he was watching with us. We all said nothing, and my sister went quiet. From then, she never mentioned anything to my parents about her past life, but I still ask her about it. I was absolutely curious about all this, and at that age, I didn't know what reincarnation was. She explained to me a bit more about what she looked like: long golden brown hair with green eyes, light freckles and fair skin. She said she was never married. She had a gray cat named Milo, and she was sad that she died because she didn't know what happened to him when she was gone. She told me different stories over time about her past life, and I had no reason to not believe her. As we got older, we didn't talk about it on a normal basis, but it did come up on occasions. We are now in our 30s, and we got together for lunch one time, and something occurred that caused us to talk about it. She went into more detail at that time about how Charlotte had died. She said the juice she had contained grape juice, and it caused her to go into anaphylactic shock, and she died from it. This is why she avoids grapes. I asked if she ever had an allergy test to see if she was still allergic to them, and she said she thought about it, but she said she remembered her death so vividly that she doesn't want to risk it. We were curious about how close she was with all this information, so we actually tried looking for Charlottes that had passed away in Texas and for house records. Surprisingly, we did find that house, and I actually found a way to contact the current owners to ask about the history of it. I told them I had grown up in the area and was trying to remember the name of an old friend that lived there. To my surprise, they were glad to help, and from the real estate they brought the house from, we were able to track down the records and found a Charlotte that lived there and her parents that owned it before her. We found pictures of her, and she matched the description my sister gave. It was crazy to actually put physical proof to what she's told us all these years. We haven't said anything to our parents since they don't seem to believe any of it. We're still trying to figure out if we can find out her cause of death, but the house and her description and time she lived was proof enough for us. This all started when my son was around 7. I remember one night we stopped somewhere to pick up dinner, and I let him choose where and what he wanted. When we got home and situated to eat, he thanked me for letting him choose, and then asked if I remembered when I was a kid and getting to choose what's for dinner. I said yes, and mentioned that I usually chose what I wanted for my birthday dinner, much like he got to choose last year. Then he asked me if I remembered when he was a grown-up and let his kid choose dinner. I just chuckled and said, "You haven't been a grown-up yet, buddy, but you can definitely do the same thing when you are." He shook his head and told me I was wrong. He mentioned he was a grown-up and that he let his son choose dinner. I didn't know how to respond, so I just stared at him for a minute. At that point, he said his name was Timothy and his son's name was Jake, and that he lived a long time ago. I was speechless. I thought maybe he was just pretending and had this crazy story he planned out, so I just dropped it from there and ate my dinner. We had more situations like this over time. I will say his mother and I split up, but we are on good terms. She is still in school to become a nurse, so I have full custody of him. She took him for about a week over summer vacation, and she had some questions when they returned. While he went to play, we were talking, and she asked me if I had watched ghost shows or something with him in the room. I told her there weren't any in particular that I could remember, and I try to avoid watching anything that could be potentially scary in front of him. She began telling me that something was brought up about what happens when you die, and he mentioned that not everyone becomes a ghost, and sometimes you get to be a new person. She then mentioned the names Timothy and Jake again. I was surprised, so I told her about the night he mentioned it to me as well. We both thought it odd, but had no explanation for it, so we agreed to just heavily monitor what we watched or listened to see if we could figure out where he may have gotten this from. From then on, as I'm watching all the shows he would watch, they had no names similar to those, and nothing about ghosts or reincarnation in them. I will say at one point, I had moved into an apartment and I didn't have cable or internet installed yet. Until then, my son just watched movies we had or whatever was on the local channels. At least I had an antenna. While I was making breakfast for us, he asked to watch TV, so I told him I'd be right in to help him. As I wrap up what I was doing, I walk into the living room to see he's already got it on, and he's watching some old Western style show. It was a Sunday, so I know there wasn't much on in ways of cartoons, but this was what he stopped on. Not to mention he was fixated on it, legs crossed, chin resting on his hands, watching. I went and asked him, "Nothing good on?" And he said without looking over at me, "I love this show." I was confused because we've never watched this before. I certainly haven't because I don't like those kind of shows. So I called that out and said, "You've never watched this before?" To which he responded, "I used to watch it all the time when I was Timothy." I didn't know how to respond again. I just stood there and watched him. When I finally came back to reality, I decided to test him and asked what the show was about. He told me the name of the show and explained it as best a 7-year-old can about what was happening, the characters' names, all of it. I was surprised. I had no explanation as to why he would know all of this, but since he found this and since I have installed cable and internet, this is what he watches on Sundays. I was worried at first about him watching it with some of the typical violence in it, but he didn't seem fazed by it, and he never acted it out or even wanted toy guns. So his mom and I agreed to let him watch it. One of the last occurrences that we came across was when we went to the park. He was going to his mom's for the weekend, and I usually drop him off there, but she was running late, so we decided to go to a park while we waited. I pushed him on the swing some, helped him across the monkey bars, the usual. At one point, his mom had called saying she was on her way, so we started walking back to my car. I was still on the phone and didn't notice at first that he stopped holding my hand. I stopped and looked back to see him staring into the entrance of a cemetery. It was a small one and older, with not many headstones in it, from what I could tell. I told his mom I'd meet her at her place, hung up, and went to my son and asked what was wrong. He said, "I know this place." Again, he has not been to any funerals, nor did he know anyone who had died. We also didn't know anyone in the cemetery, as it was by my new place. So I asked, "What makes you think that?" And he flat out said, "I was buried here." What the hell? So he started walking in, and I honestly wanted to stop him, but I also wanted to know what he was going to do. So I just followed him. He led me to an old headstone towards the back, and I froze. Sure enough, the headstone said, "Timothy, beloved son, father, brother." How? How would he have known any of this? As terrified as I was, though, I had to know, so I asked him, "How did Timothy die, bud?" I shot myself. I picked him up, and as I carried him out of the cemetery, he began crying. I didn't know what to say or do, so I think I just said something like, "You're okay now," and I just hugged him tight. I was at a loss of words, but on his way to his mom's, we stopped for ice cream, and he started cheering up. I told his mom about it too, letting her know what had happened, and she flipped out, of course. It took some convincing, but I think I finally got her to trust me that I didn't let him watch anything about suicide. Also, after this, he stopped mentioning his past life. I don't know if that was like Timothy accepting what happened and passing on, but it still confounds me. Out of curiosity, I did try to find a Timothy that lived within that time and found someone with a son named Jake, and that's where I stopped. I didn't want to find out any more information, and I'm leaving it at that. I hope my son has completely forgotten about it too, and is not being haunted by this anymore, because hearing it from a child his age was gut-wrenching. So that, my friends, was a collection of past life stories, the first kind of collection we've had on the channel, so something different. And I have to say they're one of my favorites to read or hear about. I'm intrigued with the idea of some people, typically kids from what I've seen, having these visions or thoughts of another life or experience that they have no explanation for. I don't know, maybe that's just me though. But I thought it would be a good topic to cover for the month. How about you? What do you think? And if you did enjoy this video, please do give it a like below. And if you'd like to hear more content like this, consider subscribing. And if you're already subscribed, tell your friends. Bring them along. And lastly, don't forget to leave a comment on your thoughts or let me know, do you have any games on your phone? And with that being said, my friends, I hope you have a fantastic rest of the week. And until next time, take care.